Good afternoon and welcome to the 2024 Online Economic History Workshop. Our theme for this year is Labor Unions and the State. I'm Frank Garman Jr. from Christopher Newport University, and this year's workshop is being done in collaboration with promarket.org at the University of Chicago's Booth School of Business, the George Stiegler Center for the Study of the Economy and the State. Today, Jacob Greenspon is going to discuss about labor unions' resistance or lack of it to automation in ports in the United States. And then we'll have Carlo Medici talk about his work about the effect of immigration on unionization in the 20th century United States. After Jacob and Carlo each present their papers, Aaron Hansowitz from Bethany College is going to start off our Q&A session with a couple of questions for each author. And then finally, we'll field questions for the panelists from you, the audience. You can submit your questions for consideration on X, formerly known as Twitter, using the hashtag OEHW2024, or by posting your questions directly to YouTube. We encourage you to post them as soon as you think of them, as we are streaming this session live, and that will give us time to collect our questions at the end for our panelists. Remember that all of the works that you're seeing today are works in progress. Your questions and feedback can help the presenters to improve their research. We now begin with Jacob Greenspon and his paper, Getting Workers on Board with Automation, Evidence from Shipping Container Adoption.
Hello, everyone. I'm a third-year PhD student at the University of Oxford, and this is a work in progress that will form part of my dissertation. So I'm very interested in hearing your feedback, and thank you for joining. So this paper is going to be looking at how workers are dealing with the threat of automation. Workers and automation is a pretty well-studied topic. But what I'm hoping to bring to that is that many papers in this area look at these direct replacements. So when we think of automation, it tends to be that there is a factory and one day the workers on the assembly line are replaced with robots. What I'm really interested in here is that process, but as well the indirect channel. And that's the fact that if you have two factories and one of them adopts the productivity enhancing automation and one does not, that the factory that adopts the automation is going to be eventually stealing business from the non-adopter, and workers at the non-adopter, even though they have perhaps preserved their job security in the short term by blocking an automation, are still going to be losing their jobs perhaps in the long term. So that indirect channel is something that's going to be really interesting to me, and in particular, how workers navigate that. The setting I'll be looking at for this research question is the mid-20th century containerization of U.S. shipping. This is certainly an automation shock. The labor intensity of the service of taking goods on and off a ship drastically reduced with this technological change, leading to job losses. But only some ports containerized while others did not. The second thing about this industry is that it's tradable, and it's relatively easy to observe how much competition a certain port faces from other ports that have adopted the technology. And finally, in this case, we have very powerful unions then and now in the US in dock work, and they're going to take different stances on container adoption. And I'll be exploiting this variation in unionization. So to preview, what I'll be finding first is that this indirect displacement channel is very large, nearly as large as the direct channel. I'm going to find evidence suggestive of first mover advantage, where early adopters are going to be doing better in the long term. And finally, that the relationship between union density and adoption is going to be non-monotonic. So you're going to have higher union density in some ports leading to greater adoption and to less adoption elsewhere, which I'll talk much more about later. So there's a lot of work that I'm trying to build on here. In containerization, a lot of the recent work has focused on estimating trade costs and how much productivity improvement basically there has been from containers. And more on city growth and basically how market access changes from containerization have led to growth in the cities. There's been less work actually on dock workers, And especially within the US in this period, I'm going to hope to add to that and add a bit more to the conversation, to the discussion in the literature on what's driving adoption on ports. There's a wider literature on labor displacement and automation, both in recent times and historical, and I'm going to hope to add by focusing on this indirect channel business stealing, and as well look at firm outcomes with the data that I have. And finally, in terms of automation, there's a lot of work looking historically at Luddites and guilds and the role that they may have had in blocking automation in fear of job loss. And the typical view in a lot of the literature is that if you have stronger unions or some sort of worker power or worker voice institution like guilds, you're going to have less adoption of automations that displace those workers. There's some theoretical work that is arguing that this is not necessarily the case. So I'm going to be providing some empirical evidence on when and how this happens. When I started this work, I was thinking a lot about the Hollywood writers' strike a couple of years ago and other unionized environments in the US where the union is trying to have a say on automation in their industry. And then a couple of months ago, the longshoremen in the US went on strike. And automation is core in this case. So this is a case where I'm hoping that an economic history paper can have something relevant for policy issues today. So what is containerization? It's the shift from the traditional way that cargo is moved on and off ships called break bulk cargo, where individual goods are carried on and off a ship, sometimes on a pallet, sometimes with a sling, as in the picture on the left. But it's very intensive in the use of labor, where you're having longshoremen take each good and put it on the ship, or in the case of unloading, to take it off. This is a very time-intensive, labor-intensive process. Ships would spend about 2/3 of their total time in ports. Sometimes for a week was pretty typical. And you had much smaller ports, and they would be serving their customers that were nearby. So if you think of the example of Manhattan, which I'll come back to a lot, you would have piers kind of all along the coast of Manhattan. You had a lot of factories located downtown. And this is because just from the break bulk goods handling. Longshoremen in this case tended to be more casually employed, hired on a day-to-day basis based on what ships were in port, but were still very heavily unionized. Starting in the mid-20th century in the US, you have the shift towards containerization, which is just a relatively simple idea of putting goods inside boxes and then putting those large boxes on a ship. It had been tried before, but it really worked in this time because of the other systemic transportation changes and improvements that kind of were complementary. So this containerization required huge capital investments, not just in the containers and eventually in special ships to carry them, but also in cranes that were in dockyards and in other systems to put those boxes on trucks or trains. But these paid off with huge productivity increases. They had about 1/40th the labor intensity in terms of man hours as break bulk cargo handling. And ships would spend about 94% less time in port. The first voyage we have in the US was from Newark to Houston in 1956, and over time you've got a steady increase in the number of ports that were able to handle shipping containers. So what are some of the impacts we can think about here? One is that there was greater competition between ports. So I'll come back to this point more later. But you have fewer ports that are going to be larger in this time compared to before, where you had many ports that were much smaller. This is also because there's economies of scale with containerized shipping. It's a lot more productive if you have larger ships that are taking on more cargo at a single time and only stopping at one port, rather than ships that are stopping at kind of nearly every port along the coast during their journey. You'll also have the growth of some early adopter ports. Most of the largest container ports in the US today are still ones that were among the first to containerize. Imports that adopted this technology later on or never adopted, such as San Francisco or ports of Manhattan, you have them declining and significantly and eventually disappearing even. The containerization meant as well that you needed far fewer dock workers in these containerized ports. And you can see both these trends in the plot on the right, where we have the early adopt reports in the green line from 1956 to 60, starting with a very small amount of total dock worker employment, but increasing by the end of my period significantly. You also have at the end of the period a large increase, a large amount of dock work still at kind of the slightly later adopt reports from 1961 to 1970, whereas ports that adopted much later or never adopted, with the blue and the purple line, have almost no employment by the end of the period, and despite having a lot earlier on. With this change in total employment was also a large change in the amount of in the composition of employment of dock workers. You have a big decrease in longshoremen and a big increase in mechanics and engineers and clerks. And all of these changes were happening in the context of a very heavily unionized environment. So, and the different stances were taken by these unions. There's two major dockworker unions in the US then and now, and I'll talk more about that a bit later. So the data I've collected for this is mostly from recent work. Some of it is from recent work on containerization. In terms of dock work, I'm using the early recently digitized county business patterns data, looking at the whole water transport industry and then just the subsector of longshoring for years that is available. Some census microdata, again, looking at just the longshoring occupation or the whole water transport industry. And I've digitized a bunch of new data on the annual amount of container-suitable cargo going through each port in every year. This is defined using an assessment from 1968 of which sorts of products can go inside, are feasible to ship inside a cargo container, or what typically would be shipped inside one. And I'm looking at the total tonnage or the value of those using average ton value per ton. The other main thing new data I'm adding here is I've digitized the number of union local members at each port. These are members of either one of the two dockworker unions. And I'll be using that to calculate this proxy of local bargaining power of union density. And this is just the ratio of the number of union members to what you can think of as the number of potential dock workers. And this is the pool of those workers with less than a high school education. 98% of dock workers in the time had less than high school education. So these are those that, for example, if the dock workers in a port went on strike, then these could be called in as substitute workers. And I'll be combining all this data together to get 90 major US seaports. I'm just focusing on the coasts because those are the largest, and there's a lot of other stuff going on in Great Lakes and inland ports at this time that is kind of unrelated. One of the main variables I'll be using here is on containerized competition, and this is the amount of the degree of competition that a certain port faces in a given year from other ports nearby that have adopted containers. So if and you can think about this as leveraging the substitutability of different ports. So if you are a factory in Rhode Island, you could be shipping you could be importing inputs and exporting your products through a port in Providence or through a containerized port in Boston or New Jersey. And as Boston and New Jersey as those ports are adopting a container, then the level of containerized competition that Providence would be facing increases. So the next couple maps just show what this variable looks like over time. So in 1960, there's only 6 ports that have containers in the US. So there's generally pretty low levels of competition. As you increase over time, from 1970, more ports have containerized. There's a lot more competition faced by ports, especially in the mid-Atlantic. And this just increases over time as well. So I'm going to be running 3 different analyses in this paper. The first one is going to be a panel regressions looking at annual employment and cargo handling at each port. And what I'm trying to add here is running the regression of this log count of employment or cargo tonnage on the interaction of an indicator of whether the port containerized by that year and the amount of containerized competition it faced. And this is a two-way fixed effects model. So these are trying to capture both the direct and indirect channels of automation. The first and third columns here I'll talk about are just are what I would call kind of a naive regression. In a lot of the literature on automation and its impacts on workers, you're looking at just these direct effects, or you're trying to say if you're regressing what is employment in a year in a firm on the amount of workers employed in that firm, and often you will find a positive coefficient because if a firm has adopted an automation, it is much more productive. It's going to attract more business from its rivals, and employment might go up. So that's that's why there's a positive coefficient in first and third. Now, if we look at this interaction, we're going to find that this direct association between this automation and employment of dock workers is going to be negative. As well, the association between competition and faced by a port and the amount of employment it has in a given year is also negative as well. So as competition is increasing, employment at a port is falling. But the interaction of these is in fact positive, and this could be due to a couple of reasons I can mention in the Q&A. But basically because more containerized ports, once other ports are containerized, have more trading opportunities. So this is showing what we might expect of that. Containerization seems to have been associated with falling employment in ports that containerized, but those ports that also did not containerize are also having falling employment as their rivals do adopted productivity enhancing technology. I'm next going to look at this on the firm side and find as well that firms seem to be benefiting as well from their own containerization. There's a lot more noise in this data, which I can talk more about in the Q&A. So next I'm looking at just at the cross-section of firms of ports in 1970. And I'll first be looking on the firm side outcome. And this is, again, cargo tonnage, or here I'm also going to be looking at the value of container suitable cargo handled by the port in 1970. And I'm going to be trying to understand what's happening in early adopter ports versus later adopter ports and never adopter ports with this regression here. And what I seem to find is that there is a much larger amount of cargo handled in early adopter ports relative to their rivals that adopted later or never. And so early adopters ports seem to be doing better. There's a bit of a first mover advantage. Next, I'll look at the dock workers in these ports, in these three groups of ports, and just run a mincer wage regression using this individual earnings data from the census, trying to control for other potential worker characteristics that potentially also influence earnings. And I'll be finding that looking at dock workers in these early adopter ports who've containerized by 1960, in 1970, the workers in those ports seem to be doing better as well. So some of the gains from containerization seem to be passed on to the workers in these ports. They're benefiting from there being more demand for transshipment services in these ports. So far what I found is that their employment is declining in a port after it containerizes or faces greater competition. And that port owners also seem to be benefiting, and that there seems to be some sort of first mover advantage. But all this so far has focused on, has taken adoption as given. So next, in this third and final analysis in the paper, I'm just going to be looking at what is driving a port's decision to containerize, especially early. And I'm focusing on the role of unions, as with the theme today. And as I mentioned, there's two different unions in the US who are representing dock workers. On the Pacific, you have the ILWU, and they studied this issue very closely and realized that containerization was so productivity enhancing that it would be very difficult to fight off. So they successfully bargained with the port employer associations, and they cooperated with the containerization. They didn't oppose it at each port. In exchange for compensation, such as early retirement benefits and other payoffs to workers who are going to be negatively affected by the automation. On the Atlantic and Gulf Coast in the East, you have a different union, the ILA, who was unable to successfully bargain. And so instead, they took the stance of trying to protect job security for all union members by preventing containerization wherever it was possible. And there's a lot of potential explanations for why there are different stances in the historical literature. We talk about different degrees of centralization among these two unions, different degrees to how concerned they were with business stealing, past negotiating relationships with the employer associations being very tense in the East, but not in the West. Whichever the case was, they took different stances, and I'm going to assume this relatively exogenous, and I'll be focusing just on within union. So just comparing ports within one coast and how their differences in adoption. I'll be focusing on the differing union density across ports within one coast as a measure of the union local's bargaining power, and how this is able to influence their ability to uphold or kind of make credible whatever position their overall union had of containerization. So whether that was to cooperate or to obstruct the threat of containerization. And this is differing from a lot of the literature on unions and tech adoption, where we're kind of uniformly looking at unionization as having some impact on tech adoption. So to do this, I'll just be testing, I'll just be running a regression of an indicator for early adoption by 1960 on a variety of ex-ante port characteristics. So the main ones I'll be focusing on are the degree of union density and whether you are in on the East Coast or on the West Coast, where there's these different stances. But I'll be controlling for some other potential predictors of adoption based on the literature on tech adoption and what's we're predicting early adoption. So what I find here is that first in column 1, this is just verifying a lot of the literature that this port shallowness is predicting early adoption. That's an IV that a lot of recent papers use. But once we control for that and then look at these different degrees of union density across ports, so there's a negative coefficient for the ILA. So this is in ports where the union was trying to oppose and prevent containerization. If there was lower union density, then adoption is more likely to happen. And this is reasonable. This is if there are fewer workers in a port, or if the union local has less bargaining power, it's less able to obstruct adoption of containers. On the West Coast, in the 4th line here, we have ILW union density. There's a positive coefficient. And so this is finding that in ports in this union, where the union was taking the stance of cooperating with adoption in exchange for its union members receiving payoffs, higher union density actually was leading to greater probability of early adoption. So again, this is finding a non-monotonic association here between unionization and automation. And it's suggesting that there is a possibility here where if there's greater unionization, then it facilitates a rent-sharing bargain between the workers that might be displaced by the automation and the firm that is generating most of the benefits from the productivity-enhancing automation. And it fits with some literature that's finding also that more centralized unions are better enabling technology adoption. There's some element here potentially as well of a prisoner's dilemma. If we think strategically, if all dock workers across all ports would ideally like to prevent all containerization, then that would be the best ideal outcome. However, if any of them do deviate from that outcome, they will be an early adopter. They would reap a lot of the rewards from adopting earlier and attracting a lot of the shipping business towards their port. So I believe that might be what's happening here. But as I said, this is relatively early stage work. So thank you for your time, and look forward to any questions you may have.
Well, thank you, Jacob. Next up, we have Carlo Medici and his paper, Closing Ranks, Organized Labor and Immigration.
All right. Thank you so much, Frank, for the introduction. So my name is Carlo Medici, and I'm currently a postdoc at Brown University. And the paper I'm going to talk about today is about the emergence of labor unions in the United States and the role that immigration had in this process. So let's start moderating the debate by saying that labor unions have now been for a long time very central institutions in the labor markets of all advanced economies. And we know that throughout the 20th century, they have improved worker conditions, they have reduced inequality, and they have impacted the political system and shaped policies. And although we do have by now abundant evidence on their economic and political effects, we still lack systematic empirical evidence on why unions emerge in the first place and what are the determinants of their strength. And that's what's going to be exactly the paper of the focus of this paper, where in particular, I examine the effect of a large expansion in the labor supply induced by immigration on the creation and growth of labor unions. And such an effect is actually exactly ambiguous, because on the one hand, an increased labor supply will increase labor competition and therefore incentivize workers to organize in order to protect their employment and their wages. But on the other hand, it also increases the availability of replacement workers in the labor market, and therefore decreases the cost for employers to fight unionization and fight organized labor. So ultimately, this is an empirical question, which in this paper, I tackle in the context of the early 20th century United States. This setting in particular provides an ideal context to study this question for three main reasons. First, by that point in time, the US economy was already the largest and most developed in the world, both in terms of total GDP and GDP per capita. Second, this is also the first time in which the labor movement in the US expanded nationwide, and many of the unions that are still very prominent and existing today were created or emerged in this period. And third, this is also a unique setting in US history that saw large increases in the labor supply induced by the mass and unrestricted immigration, mostly from European countries. And because this is a short presentation, I will give you now a brief preview of what I find. I show that immigration overall increased unionization. And I will find evidence which is consistent with this being driven by a reaction of existing workers as they responded to both the economic and social motivations, social threats posed by immigration, rather than immigrants themselves disproportionately joining or participating in unions. So the structure of this short talk will be the following. I will first give you a little bit more information about the historical background, and then I will introduce the data collection and the empirical strategy to then turn to the results. So I will actually be brief on the historical background since this is a historical economic history crowd, and so I don't have to spend too much time on it. But I want to highlight a few key points. The first one is that during this period, the early 20th century and the turn of the 20th century, was a very formative period for the American labor movement. Union membership grew from roughly 150,000 union members to over 4 million. And in this period, the American Federation of Labor in 1886 was created, which by the end of by 1920 represented over 80% of private sector union members. And I want to highlight two main features of unions during this time period. First, unions, which at the time were predominantly skilled unions, so organizing craft workers, those in the construction and building sectors primarily, were able to control the entry of the labor force into their occupations by mandating union membership as a condition of employment, the so-called closed shop agreements, which was still legal at the time, and by establishing and enforcing the terms of apprenticeship, so deciding on who could learn the skills required to perform a certain job. And this growth of the labor movement happened despite the legal and political framework of this time period that was very much against unionization. The right of workers to organize was not yet granted by law, and so it was particularly easy for employers to dismiss existing workers, and particularly those willing to unionize. And union recognition didn't happen yet through elections as we see it today, but it was rather through often violent fights between employees and their employers. This is also, as we are all very much aware, an age of mass migration, where over 30 million people moved from Europe to the US. And there is abundant anecdotal and historical evidence about the fact that these immigrants actually made their first appearance into the labor markets hired as strikebreakers, precisely hired by company and business owners in order to undermine organized labor. And during this time period, around the 1890s, there was also a shift in the composition of immigration. Most of immigrants until the 1880s, until the end of the 1880s, were coming from North and Western European countries, while instead from the 1890s onwards, with the reduction of the transportation cost, a lot of immigration started arriving also from Southern and Eastern European countries such as Italy, Hungary, Russia, and so on. And this change in the composition and this fears of labor competition culminated in a very hostile anti-immigration climate that we're all very much aware of, which then ended or culminated in the 1920s with the immigration restrictions, also known as the National Origins Act. And in this time period, the labor movement was actually very much concerned with labor supply expansions. Workers were worried about immigration really inducing job scarcity and putting downward pressure on wages. So at the policy level, they were very vocal in supporting the immigration restrictions that we just discussed. And at the local labor market level, really try to either exclude recent immigrants or to relegate them to the lowest paid occupations. And they also did so by adopting a rhetoric which was very popular at this point in time, targeting Southern and Eastern European immigrants, those who were perceived as more culturally distant. So let me tell you a little bit more about the data. So in order to study these questions that I'm after, one needs disaggregated data at the local level on labor unions, which didn't exist before since previous research has relied on aggregate measures of unionization, either at the national or at the state level. So not really allowing analysis across local labor markets. So in order to study this question, I assemble a novel local level, county level in this paper dataset on historical unionization by collecting and digitizing archival records on the AFL unions between 1900 and 1920, which really represents the first local level dataset on historical unionization in the US. The main sources of this data are the proceedings of the State Federation of Labor Convention, which were the subordinate bodies of the AFL at the state level. From these documents, I can directly measure the location and number of union branches and construct also novel estimates of union membership at the branch level. So let me briefly tell you how I do that. So this is an example of one of these documents for 1920 in Wisconsin. And if we zoom into one of these of the occupations that were listed in these documents, the carpenters and joiners, you can see that these documents are structured in the following way. The first column on the left is the branch or local union identifier. In the middle, you see a name of the delegate representing the union at that convention and an address. And then in the last column, the number of votes of that delegate. So how do I use this information? You can see already here that I can measure directly the number of union branches across locations. You can see that Racine, Wisconsin had one union branch, number 91, of the carpenters and joiners in 1920, while instead Milwaukee, for example, had two, 264 and 1053. So I can do this for all the occupations within a state, all the states, and over time. So 1900, 1910, and 1920. And then I can go into the constitution of these federations to find the articles that establish what was the representation rule between the number of members and number of delegates. Since, as you can see in these documents, the number of members was never systematically reported. So in this example, the document says that the basis of representation is of one delegate for every 100 members or less, and then one additional delegate for every additional 100 member. So going back to the documents that I've shown you, you can see that I can use the fact that there were 3 votes for Union Branch number 91 in Wisconsin, which corresponded to approximately 300 members. Similarly, you can do the same for the branch in Milwaukee, which had 8 votes total, which corresponded to 800 members, and so on and so forth. These rules changed over time and across states. So after collecting all the information, one can do it for all the occupations within a state, all the states, and over time. Once I do this, I can then plot the cumulative distribution of union branches of the AFL between 1900 and 1920. And by combining also this information with the richness of the data from the US full count census, I can also construct measures of union density, which is the fraction of the labor force which is made of union members. This is the map for 1900, 1910, and 1920. So at the beginning of this period, really most of the unionization was concentrated in the Northeast and Midwest. But by 1920, really unions had expanded to many other areas of the country, mostly towards West, while relatively little unionization and also immigration in this period were detected in the South. So the main estimating equation is the following that you can see now on the screen, where I'm going to be interested in examining the effect of immigration, so the share of immigrants in a county on 4 measures of unionization. Union presence, so an indicator whether the county has at least a labor union, the number of union branches, the share of unionized workers, also called union density, and the average size of these branches, so the number of members per branch. Throughout all the regressions, I will control with for county and year fixed effects, as well as county characteristics measured at baseline that likely were correlated with both immigration and unionization over time, and cluster the standard errors at the county level. However, as you can all imagine, estimating OLS regressions of this kind would likely yield bias estimates, as we may be concerned about omitted variable bias or reverse causality, given the particularly hostile climate that unions had and sentiment that had towards immigrants in this period. So in order to tackle this issue, I construct a shift share instrument that combines two sources of variation: cross-sectional variation from the allocation and settlement of immigrants across counties from different European countries in a pre-period, so in 1890, with time flows, or the shift in immigration from each European countries to the US as a whole between 1890 and 1920. And the identification assumption is the usual one, which is that unionization must not be jointly correlated with both the pre-existing settlements of immigrants and with immigration flows from each different European countries over time. And of course, in the paper, I ensure that the identification assumption is likely satisfied and that the results are robust to the many challenges and many concerns that have been raised in the literature about shift share instruments lately. But let me now focus for the last 8 or 9 minutes of this presentation on what I find. So in this table, you can see that in column 1, I'm presenting the coefficients for an indicator for whether a county has any union present. In column 2, the number of union branches. In column 3, union density, and in column 4, the average size of these union branches. In panel A, I'm reporting OLS estimates, and in panel B, two-stage square estimates. So in the interest of time, I want you to focus on panel B. These are the estimates that, for the reasons just highlighted, can be interpreted causally. And you can see that across all 4 columns, immigration had a positive effect on unionization. In particular, it increase the probability of a county of having any labor union, the number of branches, the share of unionized workers, and the number of members per branch. And these estimates imply that in the absence of immigration during this time period, the average union density between 1900 and 1920 would have been approximately 22% lower. And these effects are present both along the intensive and extensive margin. So you can see in panel A the estimates for the intensive margin, so by restricting the sample to counties that consistently had labor unions in this time period, and in panel B, the remainder of the sample, meaning that unions expanded where organized labor was already present, and also new counties saw the establishment of labor unions. And as I said earlier, I performed several robustness checks, which, in the interest of time, I will skip, but of course, I'm happy to discuss any of them during the Q&A at the end of the presentation. And of course, you can find them on included in the paper. And of course, also summarize here briefly for you. So in the last few minutes of this presentation, let me just focus on the reasons or the mechanisms of this immigration-induced increase in unionization. And I want to start by showing you a few quotes to introduce the first mechanism I test, which is whether this was a reaction of existing workers to the economic threats that immigration was posing. And these first two quotes really show how the labor movement at the time saw immigrants, both skilled and unskilled, as a threat to their mission of maintaining and raising wages and keeping hours short, and how really these workers represented competition with existing workers. But at the same time, the delegates of this convention were also complaining that immigrants really were used by companies as strikebreakers, and that whenever the police or the law was involved, companies actually really were always the one on the right side of the law. Why did I show you these three quotes? Because they really summarize again the two main forces that are behind this effect of immigration on unionization. On the one hand, an increased incentive for existing workers to unionize to protect their employment and wages. But at the same time, also the fact that employers with additional workers available in the labor market were just more able to fight unionization by replacing existing workers with the newly arrived ones. And the second force was particularly important during this time period. As I was saying earlier, the right of workers to unionize was not yet granted by law, and so it was particularly easy for employers to do so. So if this is a story of existing workers reacting to the threats, to the economic threats posed by immigration, rather than immigrants themselves joining unions, we should expect unionization as a reaction to occur more successfully if existing workers cannot be immediately replaced. Why? Because workers will still be in a stronger position to organize to keep the new immigrants out without being immediately replaced. And employers themselves will be in a stronger in a position to less likely resist unionization, as they will not have a readily available pool of replacement workers. And remember, here we're talking about skilled workers, but we're not talking about highly skilled workers whose training require many years, as we can maybe think of skilled workers today. We're talking about carpenters, bricklayers, construction workers whose skills could be acquired in a matter of months or at most a couple of years. And so really also felt threatened by the arrival of potentially unskilled workers as well, who could eventually learn the skills and then replace them in this amount of time. In order to test this mechanism, I leveraged differences in skills across occupation and examine whether there were heterogeneous effects between skilled and unskilled workers. And consistent with this hypothesis of an existing worker's reaction to immigration in the form of unionization, as you can see here, all the effects were actually driven by skilled workers. So immigration had a positive effect on the unionization of skilled workers, the gray bars in the middle, while the blue bar on the left represents the baseline effects that I showed you earlier in a table format. While instead for unskilled workers, the effects were much smaller and never statistically significant. So to then also test this a little bit more directly, I also construct a measure of competition pressure of a county to the competition, to exposure of a county to the pressure, competition pressure exerted by immigrants, whereby the intuition is very simple. A county will be more exposed to the competition brought by immigrants if the occupations that are prevalent among the immigrants that enter the US each decade, measured in the nation overall, not in the specific county, as that would clearly be very endogenous, are also predominant among the occupations of US-born workers, so existing workers in that county at the beginning of the day. And so that interactive measure of exposure to competition with the main independent variable, the share of immigrants, to show that indeed among skilled workers, more competition fostered, so increased the growth of organized labor. While among unskilled workers instead, whose bargaining power was eroded basically by the increased availability of replacement workers, more competition, in fact, slowed down the growth of unions. Finally, and this is the last piece of evidence that I'll show today, I also explore whether potentially non-economic concerns, along with the economic concerns we just talked about, also motivated existing workers to unionize in response to immigration. This is consistent with the fact that the labor movement, or most of the labor movement, and definitely AFL unions in this period, really adopted nativist position to oppose immigration. So in order to shed light on this mechanism, I will investigate heterogeneity along two dimensions, based on the composition of immigrants or a county's attitudes towards immigration. First, I find that an inflow of more culturally distant immigrants, so those from Southern and Eastern European countries at the time, really generated larger increases in unionization. And second, I showed that these effects were also larger in counties with worse attitudes towards immigration, which I measure either with the historical vote share for the Know-Nothing Party or a measure of residential segregation between US-born individuals and European immigrants measured at baseline. So all in all, this evidence is consistent with existing workers reacting to the economic and social threats posed by immigration by unionizing in order to keep new workers out of the labor force. I then rule out alternative explanations, which I'm happy to discuss in the Q&A since I think I'm running out of time. So let me just mention that I also find that immigration induced a change in the representation of US-born workers across different occupations. And in particular, I find that US-born workers were more likely to be employed in occupations with union protection. And second, that these effects of immigration or unionization persist over time. So even today, counties that receive metropolitan areas that receive more immigration in this time period between 1890 and 1920 still display higher unionization. So let me conclude, because I think I'm out of time for real this time. So I showed you that immigration increased unionization in this time period in the United States, and that the evidence is consistent with the reaction of the existing workers for economic as well as social motivation. So this is the first paper that empirically analyzes the emergence of labor unions by also introducing the first county-level data set on historical union presence and membership throughout the United States. And the results of this paper, on the one hand, highlight a new driver of unionization, which was a key one during this time period, as it accounted for roughly 22% of union density of this time. And second, they also highlight a novel consequence of immigration, which is the development of labor market institutions that aim to protect worker status in the labor market. Thank you all very much for your attention, and I'm very happy to take any questions.
Well, thank you, Carlo. And we have time now for questions for our panelists. One question to start us off with. Each of your papers involve competition, and competition is key to understanding each of your models. How do you account for competition or measure it in each of your papers?
I'm happy to start off. So when I talk about competition in my model, I'm focusing on the degree of competition that any given port in a certain year faces from other ports. So that's just really competition effectively in a product market where the product is the service of taking goods off a ship and bring them on shore, or the reverse. And so I've measured that using effectively it's a distance weighted measure of other ports containerizing. So it's very large for the Port of Brooklyn once the Port of Newark containerizes. But for the Port of Brooklyn, if Seattle containerizes or Los Angeles, then that measure would be a lot smaller.
Yeah, so in my case, it's I spent only 30 seconds because I was running out of time on it. So it's a measure that relies on the distribution of occupations among the immigrants that entered the United States over time between 1890 and 1920, and the occupations that were prevalent among the US-born workers, so the existing workers in a specific county. So you can see the results of the paper show that for skilled workers, more competition pressure indeed led to more unionization, because those were the workers who were able to unionize and to respond to immigration because they had enough bargaining power and they were in a stronger position to start with. While instead, for unskilled workers, this was not possible because they could just be immediately replaced by the newly arrived workers, and so they didn't have the bargaining power to really react to immigration in that way.
So, Jacob, I want to push you to think about your model a little bit. And I'm going to use an analogy. So there's this story about when the British marched to Lexington and they get routed by the Americans, that the British would have surrendered if they had someone to surrender to. So one of the challenges when it comes to labor management, whether you unionize or not, you still have workers who can make your life hell, with or without a union. I strongly recommend a book called Managerial Dilemmas by Gary Miller, where he documents these issues. And so one way to think about your union model is not does the union resist, but does the union provide the contracting solution to negotiate with a group of workers that enables a buyout to be even possible? That without the union, you still would have had trouble containerizing because workers have enough independence in what they do that they could have messed it up for you anyways. Uh, and something that I also want to push you to think more about is what's different about the West Coast or East Coast. I know you're aware of that question, but are there contracting issues? Are there things about the makeup of the West Coast unions that make their contracts credible over there to get a buyout that isn't true in the East Coast? I mean, a lot of union stuff is about negotiations. So are there contracting issues that prevent the East Coast from even considering entering this type of contract? Uh, or is there a more rent opportunities in the East Coast? Part of the benefits that these workers were getting during this time period was their ability to steal stuff off the cargo ships, right? So was there more opportunity to steal stuff? Was there more of a loss on the East Coast that made it more expensive to buy them out. Uh, Carlo, I really would like to see your model expand and include the Great Migration. So the Great Migration, for you who aren't familiar with it, is African American migration from the South to the North, because it could have some of the very same issues that you're talking about. We know those were major tensions. If you talk about the unionization of Ford, Ford had a lot of African American workers. They were very anti-union because they were afraid that the union was going to lead to discriminatory wages. That was going to be to their disadvantage because Ford was known for paying similar wages to African Americans than as he paid to white Americans. There's some nuances to that, but we'll leave it at that for now. The other thing that I would be very curious to think about more for you is that you really have a good starting point to discuss about organization serving as a transmission of ideas. Are you seeing that in these unionized areas, even if they have low immigration, but they have some unions there that connect to the AFL, that they are successfully transmitting ideas from the more urban areas to these areas that seeing less immigration? And then the other thing that I'd be curious to know, because what you're describing is very much an anti-ethnic movement, are we seeing lingering effects in who makes up membership of skilled unions today? Is this anti-immigration movement meaning that today, a pipe fitter in Pennsylvania is more likely to be white, is more likely to be Anglo-Saxon and not Italian, or is that something that dissipates? And if it does dissipate, how long did it take?
I suppose I'll start. So to your second question, around why the West Coast and not the East Coast in terms of the different union stances. So I briefly mentioned this, but I didn't have time, so thank you for asking this. So in the historical literature, there's sort of a couple different reasons here. I haven't thought of the pilfering of goods, which is an interesting thing to think of. One thing that is definitely different between the two unions is the degree of centralization. So on the West Coast, there's a coast-wide contract that the union is doing for every single port. On the East Coast, individual ports tend to be negotiating with locally the contracts with each employer. So that's one definitely important difference. There seems to be some suggestions that just from the statements of the union leaders at the time that on the West Coast they were a lot more attuned to the fact that if they didn't containerize, they'd be losing business to the East Coast. And I should be very clear to mention this: the West Coast and the East Coast at this time are even competing for business. If you're in Chicago, you can be exporting goods to either one of them. But even there's stories of good companies in Ohio or even further east that are exporting through the West Coast. So that the West Coast was a bit more attuned to business dealing, so this means they were maybe a bit more willing to engage with this. And that kind of as you may have suggested as well, the negotiation is hugely important here. The relationship between the East Coast unions and the employers there was much worse. They were constantly on strike in this period, and there was kind of a perception that they couldn't negotiate in good faith. But to be clear, they did attempt to negotiate as well. They just didn't strike a bargain in the same way the West Coast did of facilitating containerization in exchange for some buyouts. So that's the second question. Hopefully I captured your points there. On the first question of whether the unions are a contracting institution that enables job buyouts relative to non-unionized workers, I would 100% agree with that. That's something I'm hopefully capturing my union density measure. And particularly, just to illustrate that a bit more, on the West Coast, a lot more of what you see is that the buyouts are only going towards workers that are in the union and have been in the union for some time. So if there is a greater share of dock workers or potential dock workers that are not in the union or not receiving those job buyouts, which in my measure would be a lower union density on the West Coast, then that would potentially mean that they are in that port there's going to be higher resistance to adoption, and that they'd be less likely to adopt. So hopefully that's something I'm capturing, but thank you for asking, because that allows me to expand on a point that I didn't have quite enough time to do. So thank you.
Thank you, Aaron. So those were three fantastic questions. So let me start with the second one, which I interpreted as you asking whether basically this idea, when you were talking about ideas, whether these ideas of unionization were also being transmitted to other counties, whether there were some sort of spillovers from counties that unionized to others that were not unionized, and whether this helped the spread, this even in absence of immigration. So this doesn't seem to be the case. It didn't. I checked whether we know today that unionization is also a social phenomenon, right? Not just an economic phenomenon. And so when a certain plant starts unionizing in a certain place, then other workers get encouraged to maybe unionize. We have been seeing that also with Starbucks, Amazon, and so on today. So this didn't seem to be the case at the time. So these were really localized effects within local labor markets, which could be within counties or SEAs, state economic areas. And for the other two questions, so both on the Great Migration and more like long lasting effects, I don't have good questions. I totally agree. In fact, these are work in progress. I don't have results yet to share. I totally agree that it would be super interesting to examine the effects of the Great Migration. I don't necessarily think it belongs to the same paper, just because there are many differences that should be taken into account. And, one cannot really fit everything in the same story necessarily. Also, the Great Migration, the peak of the Great Migration also coincided with changes in legislation, the Wagner Act, so the right of unionize to be became legal, and so also industrial unions really developed during this time period. The CIO unions were created, and so I think it would be a super interesting paper and one that I'm actually working on. And so I hope to share results soon with you, as well as the one about more long-term persistence, also in occupational distribution and so on. I'm also working on something related to that. So once again, I'll be happy to talk more in the coming months about that. Sure. Thank you.
A question for Jacob is about whether or not ports that didn't shift to containerize, if they ended up specializing in break bulk, and if that led to any sort of path dependency almost there. If you continue to specialize in break bulk, then if you have cargo that requires break bulk, you send it to that port. Does that discourage them from ever containerizing, or delay it even further, or reinforce the effects that you're describing?
Yeah, thank you. So just to clarify, the break bulk cargo, it's these individual goods, and those can all go into containers. So there's certainly some ports here that even today are still specialized in break bulk, but they're very small, and there's just not as much of a market in break bulk shipping anymore, because instead there's a large market in putting all those break bulk goods in containers. So rather than someone in a port that has not containerized, going and kind of and shipping that as break bulk goods through their local port, they're more likely to put it into container, and especially when because you have such improvements in land transport here with the interstate highway system and rails in this period, they're more likely to just ship that to another port that has containerized. What I think might have happened, and it's a great question, I haven't looked at it, is whether ports that did not adopt shifted towards things that don't go into containers. So dry bulk goods like wheat, or liquid bulk goods like oil. Those can go into containers. And so there might have been a shift into those. Both of those types of goods are also far less intensive in terms of longshoring work.
Interesting. And Carlo, another question about your data. When you look at immigration, are you able to disaggregate it for individual counties to look at the percentage of the population that would have been native born versus who would have immigrated? Or when you're measuring immigration, is it more at the aggregate level?
Yeah, thank you for the question. So really, so it is definitely at the individual level. So for at least for the years the census here is 1900, 1910, and 1920. The data come from the full count US population census. So really, I have the individual level data on their country of origin, time of arrival, year of arrival in the US, and so on. While instead for the year 1890, which is the one that I use to inform the shift share instrument, that's at the county level because that's what it's available, since the 1890 full count census was actually destroyed in a fire, as we are unfortunately all aware of. But thank you for the question and letting me clarify this. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. And thank you to our panelists on behalf of the Online Economic History Workshop, the organizers, and promarket.org. I want to thank Jacob Greenspon and Carlo Medici for sharing their research with us. Thanks to Aaron Hansowitz for his comments and questions and for organizing this session. I also want to thank the audience for taking the time to join us and for their insightful questions. Your questions help us to improve our panelists' research and advance our understanding of the past. To learn more about the papers in other panels or to sign up for email notifications for future events, go to www.oehw.org. You can also read about ongoing economic research involving these and other topics at promarket.org. Thank you again.
Thank you.
Thank you.